Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima reporting from Kiev about the war in Ukraine. In today's podcast, week 53 of war in Ukraine, and this is the first week of March 2023. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about the battle in Bakhmut and the problems with weapon supplies to Ukraine. So the battle for Bakhmut continues. A truly severe battle. Ukrainian troops hold the most of the city, although some of our units will withdraw from the city. This is more a matter of rotation and not in order to withdraw. A significant number of our troops are still fighting there. There are enough people and equipment. The enemy captured the eastern part of the city to the Bakhmutska River. The main attack of the Russian is not in the city, but from the north, bypassing the city. The fight is over the supply path that remains under Ukrainian control. However, this path is under the constant fire of the enemy. The Russian army is pushing our troops to withdraw from Bakhmut, and the enemy is advancing slowly, and that is why the Ukrainian command is sure that there are still opportunities to hold the escape routes for a while, slowing down the pace of advance and inflicting even more losses on the Russians. Holding the city for us is in conditions of limited communication is not helping us much from the point of view of tactics. This is a matter of strategy. The Ukrainian command will hold the city until the last opportunity as always. Unlike the cities of Kherson, Izium, Liman, Kupiansk, from which the Russians fled, the Ukrainians did not leave the city without a long resistance. The enemy is forced to pay dearly and slowly moves from landing to landing, from house to house. Everyone who fights in the city in unfavorable conditions hoped that the time of the heroic resistance is used to create reliable, well equipped, and camouflage defense lines to cover Seversk, Chasavoy Yar, Konstantinivka, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, which on these lines combat capable troops will be withdrawn in time, which will be reliably entrenched and will be able to defeat the enemy. On Sunday, March 5th, the commander of the ground forces, Colonel General Alexander Sirsky, visited the units defending Bakhmut and approached to the city. According to him, the fighting has reached the highest level of tension. The enemy, through Wagner private groups, additional forces into the battle. Our soldiers are courageously defending their positions in the north of city Bakhmut, trying to prevent the encirclement of the city, said the General Sirsky. According to him, the armed forces of Ukraine inflicted significant losses on the enemy and destroyed a large amount of equipment. However, we also have hundreds of killed and wounded soldiers. Our resistance at the bridgehead has been going on for several months. All this time, the enemy's attempts to capture the city were defeated by the steadfastness of our soldiers. Our defenders inflicted significant losses on the enemy, destroyed a large amount of tanks and other equipment, and forced Wagner's best assault units into the battle and reduced the enemy's offensive potential, he said. Also, before his visit on March 5th, the General Sirsky, visited Bakhmut on March 3rd. And previously, before March 3rd, he came to the city on February 25th. So it's strictly under the general's control. During the meeting of the staff of the Supreme Commander in Chief on March 6th, Sirski and the head of the armed forces Zaluzhny spoke in favor of continuing the Bakhmut defense operation. Battles for Bakhmut have been going on since July 2022. It's over 7 months of severe madness. The General Staff of the Armed Forces reported that the Russian army continues to try to surround and capture the city of Bakhmut, but its actions are unsuccessful. The Russian occupiers, through trained units of the Private Wagner Infantry Regiment and other regular units of the Russian army, to capture the city. Currently, the enemy is attacking the city from three different directions. Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov estimated the daily losses of the Russian Federation in the battles for Bakhmut around 500 killed and wounded. On February 28th, he announced that reinforcement had been sent to Bakhmut. Holding the city, he assured, it's military rather than the political decision. International Study of War Institution Study of War analysts also believe that the Russian occupation forces will not be able to capture Bakhmut in the near future and force the Ukrainian troops to retreat, although they have secured a positional advantage in certain areas of the city. The commanders of Eastern Group of Forces emphasized that there is no mass withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the city of Bakhmut, but a planned rotation. Of the events that we're observing, there are two main routes: the Konstantinivka Bakhmut route and the road from the city of Chasiv Yar to the western outskirts of Bakhmut. In fact, these are two roads, the roads of life, along which supplies and logistics go, and the wounded are taken away from there. And of course, control over these routes is a visual for us. As far as we know, despite the fact that the Russians are shelling both roads and they came close enough to the Bakhmut Konstantinivka road, the Ukrainian forces still managed to push them back. It is in the area of the settlement of Ivanovsky, and Ukraine now controls these two roads, but they're still heavily shelled by Russian invaders. There are no intentions to leave Bakhmut yet, despite the complexity of the situation, despite the losses and the shelling. It is not hell, but sometimes more than hell. The mood of our military is quite combative. Well, indeed, again to confirm this, the message that appeared on the website of President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky that there was a meeting of the Supreme Commander in Chief, and as reported, Zelensky asked Zaluzhny and Sirsky questions about Bakhmut, question about what the best strategy, and they both confirmed they believe we have to keep the defense going. We have to stand until we have no choice but to retreat. If we look at the losses of Russians, they are simply insane. The Secretary of the Security Council of Ukraine, Danilov, announced that the ratio is 1 to 7. So for every one of our fallen soldiers, there are 7 killed Russian troops. According to the British intelligence, this ratio approximately 1 to 5. They're really just grinding their own army there. Further, they attempted an offensive in the Luhansk direction, and they have attempted an offensive near Vuhledar. And in both of these directions, their so-called offensive were chalked. Now we can also see that if the defensive near Bakhmut chokes, favorable conditions are really being created for Ukraine for a counter-offensive campaign. I think that our military is preparing for this. Therefore, with all the strategy of the situation in Bakhmut, given the quality of the people we're losing there, I think that Bakhmut is fulfilling its function of slowing down the Russian offensive, grinding down the Russian troops, and preparing the conditions for a major Ukrainian counteroffensive. The fact that General Sirski visited Bakhmut for the third time in 10 days is truly motivates our soldiers. You know, when the soldiers see that the generals are with them, they fight, realizing that their task is important, that their lives are important, and that the generals are not afraid to risk their lives. Second, in order to properly plan operations, generals need to see everything with their own eyes. When you see the situation on the map, it's one thing. But when you see the situation when the enemy is only 5 or 700 meters away from you, it is a completely different feeling. And you see the problems that our soldiers have, you see their readiness, you see those factors that usually in this military calculator, which operates on the number of troops and the number of armored vehicles, simply do not reflect readiness for battle, motivation, military intelligence, and coherence. You can see these factors only when you are directly on the hotspot, and that is why our generals go to the front lines very often. The spring weather is always on the other side of the defender and against the attacker because it prevents effective advancement. Just a few days ago, the crossroads began, and the guys in Bakhmut started talking about the fact that they say the weather is on our side. That is, the weather prevents the effective advance of Russian troops. I think our immediate task at the crossroads and the bad weather is to grind out as many Russian troops as possible during their offensive when the weather doesn't favor them. They basically drown in the mud and have difficulties moving forward. But when they're exhausted, I think maybe in 1 or 2 months, it is worth waiting for the Ukrainian counteroffensive. In the last couple of weeks, there had been a great deal of news, provocation, skepticism, and predictions about the situation in the hottest part of the Bakhmut front line. Russian private army leader Prigozhin suggested that Zelensky to give up on the town in a video message. However, in a new video issued a few days later, he said if Russia loses the Bakhmut battle, we will lose the war very quickly. The Ukrainian military said in its morning battlefield assessment on Saturday that Russia has continued its efforts to encircle the city from three sides over the past 48 hours. In the worst case, the thousands of Ukrainian troops fighting in Bakhmut could become surrounded, starved of ammunition, and be killed or pushed to surrender. Still, according to several analysts, this outcome is very unlikely. The Ukrainian military said we might back down from some positions to save our soldiers and take strategically better defense lines to prevent the enemy from taking the whole town. Despite all the rumors and speculation, Ukraine keeps doing its primary job in Bakhmut, eliminating between 3 and 500 Russian soldiers every day. Russia still doesn't fully realize that throwing all its best troops over the last 7 months to capture one town might be a well planned trap. When Ukraine's forces gather enough ammunition and equipment to start their offensive this spring, the Russian troops will be totally worn out and unable to present a decent defense. Let's talk about the weapon supplies. A promised weapon supplies by the Western allies. So some of the Western supplies for Ukraine unfortunately ran into some issues. And some of the weapon supplies are rejected by our allies as well. For example, a senior Pentagon official argues against providing the fighter jets F 16. A senior Defense Department official argued against providing F 16 and the necessary training for Ukraine because of how long it would take, it costs, and Ukraine's most urgent priorities. As you know, Ukrainian government has been begging to provide F-16 jets in order to change the situation at the front lines. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Colin Kahl said it would take 18 months to provide F-16s to Ukraine and train their pilots to fly their fourth generation fighter. The cost of doing so would quickly drain the US money it's authorized to provide to Ukraine, Kahl said, when F-16s are not one of the top three priorities for Kiev right now. Kahl said Ukraine's top three priorities remain air defense, artillery, and armor, which he noted Ukraine President Vladimir Zelensky emphasized that Joe Biden during the meeting in Kiev said that we might look at this possibility. We might look at providing F-16 fighter jets, but still there was no decision been made. According to the US government officials, the cost of sending 36 older F-16s to Ukraine, approximately half of what the US Air Force estimates Ukraine will ultimately need to replace its Soviet era fighters, will cost about $2-3 billion. Also, the US, Germany, and a few European government officials are discussing the timeline for Ukraine to win this war. We all know that war in Ukraine is is basically creating unfavorable conditions for European countries' economies. The three allies want to see Ukraine liberating all its territories and are not interested in partial success. Otherwise, the West would pressure Ukraine to sit down at a negotiation table with Russia. In the meantime, the allies have to agree to continue supply military aid to Kiev. So you understand that Ukraine is in a very difficult position. The promised weapons, most importantly tanks, are arriving at the front lines very slowly. The 300 tanks pledged by the European allies and necessary to start Ukraine's full scale offensive should arrive in the late spring or early summer. Moreover, the US Abrams tanks will arrive only next year, and fighter jets will not arrive anytime soon. The conclusion is that Ukraine must win the war by fall with insufficient weapons if it's not to begin negotiations with Russia. If Kiev is forced to negotiate, it means being ready for territory concessions. If Kiev doesn't agree to Russian terms, the West will cut its weapon supplies and the war might turn into a frozen and long-lasting conflict. We all hope it's not going to happen. At the same time, Europe is unable to send the promised tanks to Ukraine quickly. According to the European government officials, political leaders faced unexpected resistance from coalition partners of their defense ministries. Some armies had to call on retired instructors to teach Ukrainian soldiers how to use older tanks. And some countries realized that the tanks in their reserves either don't work or lack of spare parts. Difficulties with the supply of Leopard tanks to Ukraine have become the most vivid manifestation of reality that Europe has long ignored, enjoying the post Cold War thaw. Countries have chronically underfunded their armies. So when Russia launches the largest war on the country since World War II, they were woefully unprepared. Today, European Union has 2,000 Leopard 2 tanks of various models, but Ukraine cannot even secure the few hundred that needed to start offensive. Germany offered 18 units and Poland 14. However, the number of tanks to be delivered continues to fall. So Ukraine is in a truly tricky position. Everyone wants Ukraine to win. Everyone wants and pushes Ukraine to liberate its territories and to defeat Russia in order to bring peace, not into Ukraine, but also to the world. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to my podcast. If you like our podcast, please share with your friends.